Rebellion phase of the kingdom story leaves us in the depressing situation that all of our coping strategies fail to address the deepest issues, leave us in the graveyard. Ecclesiastes sees through every coping strategy that we devise. Even if they make things better, they don't really solve the problem. Fortunately, the story doesn't end there. We are not endlessly stuck in that situation and with the ethics that we use to cope with it. The next moment in the kingdom's epic story is a point of departure, a huge point of departure, the anticipation of God's full plan to deal with the situation once and for all. I'm going to call this phase anticipation, the era of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's in these generations that God begins with the infant, or maybe the embryonic, Israel. Israel's specific origin story in those patriarchs is the beginning of God's full response to the challenge. Israel is God's chosen covenant people. This is a people that's called to belong to God, to know God, and to live under God in peculiar ways. That's 1 Peter 2:9's phrase, we are a peculiar people. Not just for its own sake, not even just for its Lord's sake, but for the sake of all human beings. This is the focus of the last 3/4 of the book of Genesis, whose promises and whose blessings and whose stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their messed up, dysfunctional families show you the hints, the glimmers of a goal coming into view to bring us back into order and into loving union with God. The stories and the promises and blessings in Genesis are anticipations of the unfolding preparation, that's the next phase that we'll discuss, the preparation of a people through whom God's kingdom will eventually arrive. Matthew 11 gives us a retrospective view on this from Jesus. He tells the crowds, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist. Yet, the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God, is greater than he. All the prophets and the law prophesied until John. Jesus there frames everything from Genesis all the way through to the beginnings of his own life and ministry in John the Baptist as preparation, making ready for the Lord a people prepared for the coming of the kingdom. So this stage, the rest of Genesis, is like the third moment in this epic history. Anticipation concerns the patriarchal promises and the protections that God grants them during this embryonic, very vulnerable stage in the beginning of this new people through whom the kingdom will eventually arrive. To make this huge, long, complicated history of preparation somewhat manageable, I'm going to rely on categories from medieval spirituality, and specifically a threefold schema from Dionysius the Areopagite, who describes God's prescription for a good prognosis, a good ending to our predicament. I'm using Crapes' language there, in terms of a threefold spiritual path. One is the purgative way, the way of purgation, of letting go, of getting rid of what doesn't belong. And I'm going to crystallize that into the word go. God is often telling his people to go, and some of that going is leaving behind what they had. Another aspect of that spiritual path is called the illuminative way. Illumination is where we come to greater knowledge of the truth. I'm going to use one word for that, behold. God is often telling his people, telling anyone who will watch, behold, come and see. The third aspect of the spiritual path God has us on is called the unitive way, the way of unity with God. The word I'll use for that is come. Come to me, the Lord says. All of them are already visible in the anticipation stage of the kingdom's history, the end of Genesis, and they become much more obvious in the preparation and formation stages that we'll see in the future. These three ways were originally seen as happening simultaneously. That's how St. Bonaventure described it. You might say it's three paths in one, or one path in three. And I prefer that over the later development where those paths were seen as sequential. First came the purgative way, where we left behind what we couldn't take. And then came the way of illumination, where along the way to a journey into God's presence, we come to a greater and greater knowledge. And finally, after we've been prepared in all those ways, we are ready for the third and final path of unity, of unification with God. In the early church, Evagrius described these as the beginner stage of spiritual growth, the proficient, or you might say the intermediate, and the perfect or finished stage of spiritual growth. Jeremy Taylor, who was a contemporary of John Wesley and important in the Wesleyan holiness tradition, also saw this as a sequence that we travel on one link at a time. I think that development, turning the three aspects into three elements in a longer sequence, and especially having the sequence put unity at the end, is a move away from the kingdom's true story in the Bible and an embrace of the Platonism that became so attractive to the early church and has remained attractive throughout the Western and Eastern Christian traditions ever since. I think the Bible's story works better if we see these three aspects of one path as simultaneous. So I'll be drawing more loosely on those three paths, and I'll be using them non-sequentially. Let's look at some of the big themes in this anticipation stage from Genesis 12 to Genesis 50. The first stage roughly covers Genesis 12 through 35, God's covenants with Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob, which initiate gracious relationships, unitive relationships, relationships of belonging to God, with unworthy people, conniving characters, and yet responsive people who become a new beginning for the earth after the wreckage of Babel and the confusion that resulted from it. Remember, Genesis 11 left the world's people scattered and their tongues confused. And so when God calls this random guy Abram and begins something new, the formation of a people through whom to bless all the families of the earth, God is going about a new way of restoring his creation through a people. God elects a people and makes them out of what were no people at all. God doesn't so much adopt a people as God creates one out of a husband and wife who are too old to have children. And that's significant, right? This is going to be an action of God's to make his name known among all peoples, all the families of the earth, every tribe, tongue, and nation. We've already seen two of the three aspects of this relationship. On the one hand, God has inaugurated a relationship where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their nations belong to him. That's the unitive way already in the beginning. And they will come to know the Lord, and through them the world will come to know the Lord. That's the illuminative way. The third aspect of this relationship shows up in the way that these patriarchs need to leave behind what's old, their old homelands, their old gods, their old surroundings, and their old lives in order to embrace this new thing God is beginning through them. That's the way of purgation, the purgative way. Another purgative aspect of the lives of the patriarchs is the way God engages the cultural features that they're familiar with as members of the ancient Near East, while at the same time subverting many of those cultural features. For one thing, the law of primogeniture, where the firstborn is the designated heir of a patriarch. Well, not in the case of Isaac, because Ishmael isn't the son of the promise. Not in the case of Esau, though he's the firstborn, Jacob tricks him out of his blessing. All of these subversions, even purgations, of the cultural mindset of the patriarchs display God's otherness and sheer sovereign covenanting will. Another way that these chapters of Genesis anticipate features of Israel's preparatory life is these families' difficult relations with neighboring peoples. Genesis 33 and 34 describe the family's difficult relations with the ones who become the Canaanites. The story of Dinah and Shechem, this horrible snowballing cycle of retribution and destruction that creates lasting enmity between Israel and its neighbors. Israel's difficult relations with neighboring clans and peoples carry forward its fallenness, its brokenness, indefinitely, generation after generation, so that no system or structure will solve its moral dilemma or end its moral struggle. At the same time, these frustrations and defeats, one after another, also demonstrate God's determination to see his plan through and to see his own people through that plan. Those fractious relationships across families, across clans, across whole nations, those resemble our difficult circumstances too, even in our era, showing that the problem is not just particular cultures. The problem that we suffer is culture itself. Culture itself is a moral obstacle, not just particular cultures which need particular reforms, but the predicament that all of us are in just because we are the tribes and tongues and nations that sin has made us. The fact that we take on different lives, different interests, different ways of thinking and perspectives, that prolongs the confusion and the division of the human race that certainly exists ever since Genesis 11 after Babel, but really exists ever since Genesis 3, when the man and the woman decided to go their own way instead of following God's way. A final feature of these chapters that's noteworthy for our purposes are the family's internal struggles, the drama of Abraham's and Isaac and Jacob's families. Those are displayed especially in the Joseph cycle in Genesis 37 through 50. You see people who are just doing what they want to do to get what they want. It's frankly a pretty amoral picture, and it resembles our picture to this day. We recognize ourselves in this dysfunctional extended family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that shows that even the smallest family, and not just ancient ones, but even the most modern family, those relationships are mired in the same moral dilemma that they're suffering. We see ourselves in them, and that means we recognize that we are in a common predicament. The theological term for this will be original sin. We all stand in the same mess that comes after the rebellion. At the same time, because we see ourselves in them, and because God's plan is a foundation for hope for them, it can be one for us too. We don't need to be sucked into the pointlessness of our lives, because in this dysfunctional family, we see the beginnings of a way out, God's way out. Here's more illumination. We see a way out because God is showing a way out. There is an intensifying series of illuminations, an illuminative way anticipated in this family's sagas. Abraham's vision of the stars in the sky, his dream in which God cuts a covenant with him, Jacob's ladder connecting heaven and earth and resting on him, which is a picture of the way that God will reforge the relationship of the imago Dei, the image of God, that we broke. Joseph's dreams, which begin to disclose a way that God will not just sustain this family, but use this family in a way that all will bow down to it. All of these dreams are light shining in darkness, or at least glimmering in darkness, pointing them toward a future they don't know yet, but they can come to trust in. Finally, the Joseph cycle reveals the moral force of particular persons and particular personalities. Jacob's personality, Leah's personality, Joseph's personality, Judah's. They have evolving moral characters. A narrative, each of them, that contributes to the grand narrative by which God anticipates this rescue operation. God is with them through it all and through their own evil actions. God remains with them. That is the unitive way. Finally, in these chapters, from Genesis 37 all the way to Exodus 1, we see God sustaining this family through a famine that would have destroyed them. And then, in Exodus 1 through 18, we see God liberating Israel out of Egypt in another grand act of leaving behind Egypt and leaving behind the life of slavery, which also is a purgation, a setting aside of what doesn't belong. You have not received a spirit of slavery, Paul says later on, but one of adoption, sonship. Well, that spirit of sonship is anticipated back here in Egypt, back in Exodus, as God delivers a people the way a mother delivers a child from its own gestation into a life of its own.